My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm a graduate student at MIT studying with Professor Carrie Cahoy. Today I'm going to be talking about the optical modeling, alignment, and testing for the Deformable Mirror Demonstration Mission, or DEMI, CubeSat payload. DEMI is an optical payload that was designed and built at MIT on board a 6U CubeSat that launched to the International Space Station in February of this year. Here you can see a picture of the DEMI spacecraft right before we delivered it for launch in the winter. First, I'm going to give an overview of the DEMI optical payload. DEMI is essentially a mini space telescope on board a 6U CubeSat from Blue Canyon Technologies. DEMI stands for the Deformable Mirror Demonstration Mission. Deformable mirrors are used to correct aberrations and speckles due to mechanical, thermal, and optical effects as part of an adaptive optics system. They enable the high wavefront stability which is required for exoplanet direct imaging with coronagraphs. Down here you can see a diagram of a typical adaptive optics system. Light coming from a telescope has various distortions due to the atmosphere or thermal and mechanical effects in the optics of the telescope. A wavefront sensor is used to measure these distortions, and a control system uses these measurements to control an adaptive or deformable mirror to correct them, so you can get a better image on your science camera. In the middle, you can see adaptive optics in action. This image of Uranus on the left is distorted due to aberrations from atmospheric turbulence. This is the same effect that causes the stars to twinkle at night. On the right, you can see an adaptive optics system is being used to correct for these aberrations and provides a much higher resolution image. Over here is a picture of this technology applied to exoplanet direct imaging. This is a picture of a gas giant exoplanet, but as you can see, it's kind of hard to tell that this is the planet compared to all these speckles in the background. These speckles are due to wavefront errors in the coronagraph system and stray light. This light needs to be very carefully controlled in order to enable this sort of image. This is a gas giant exoplanet about 13 times the size of Jupiter. Enabling this sort of image of an Earth-sized planet around a sun-like star is an immense technical challenge and requires very precise wavefront control on a space-based telescope. DEMI works towards this goal by showing that a microelectromechanical system's deformable mirror can work in space. MEMS deformable mirrors are of particular interest for space telescopes due to their small size and high stability. DEMI is going to show that MEMS deformable mirrors can operate in space in response to launch vibrations, space radiation effects, the orbital thermal environment, and long-duration space operations. The main objective of the DEMI mission is to characterize on orbit a 140 actuator Boston Micromachines Corporation MEMS deformable mirror. Here's an image of the flight mirror for DEMI. This gold part in the middle is the reflective part of the mirror and is about the size of a dime. Behind that, there are 140 separate actuators that individually control the shape of the continuous mirror. DEMI is going to demonstrate on orbit closed-loop mirror control using both a Shack-Hartman wavefront sensor and an image plane wavefront sensor. We're also going to improve the point spread function, or PSF, of an astronomical source on a CubeSat platform. Next, I'm going to step through the optical design of DEMI. It's essentially a mini space telescope with an adaptive optics instrument behind it. There are two ways for light to enter the DEMI system. When we look at external sources like stars, light comes through the primary aperture and is focused by the primary mirror onto this field mirror. We also have an internal calibration laser for internal measurements of the deformable mirror. This light comes through an optical fiber and is injected through a tiny hole in the field mirror. Light from either source then bounces off of another mirror and hits the deformable mirror. From there, it hits a beam splitter, and half of the light is reflected into the plane of the screen and imaged on an image plane wavefront sensor, which takes a picture of the point spread function of whatever we're looking at. Here's an example of a point spread function over here from that sensor. The rest of the light bounces off of a pair of relay optics and hits a Shack-Hartman wavefront sensor. The Shack-Hartman wavefront sensor consists of a lens-lit array and a camera. The lens-lit array takes the incident wavefront and splits it up and focuses it into a grid pattern of spots on the camera. When the light is distorted, these spots actually move, and you can measure the displacement of these spots to back out the shape of the distortion and use that information to control the deformable mirror to correct them and steer the spots back to their nominal position. Next, I'm going to talk about an optical diffraction model that I developed of the DEMI payload. I developed this diffraction model using the Physical Optics Propagation in Python, or POPI software package, which is free and open source, available on GitHub. This model was used to predict the effect of individual actuator pokes on the deformable mirror on the signals on the Shack-Hartman and image plane wavefront sensors. This simulation was used to have a baseline to compare flight data to, and also to provide simulated data in order to practice and validate our data processing algorithms for the DeMi payload. Here is a summary of the optical model inputs for the POPI model. It is all based on the DeMi optical payload design, so I'm not going to go into detail of each of these numbers here, but for more information on where these numbers come from, there's a nice summary of the optical design in this paper, cited here. POPI simulates an optical system as a series of principal planes using Fourier optics, and uses matrix Fourier transforms to propagate a wavefront array between pupil and image planes. Therefore, it represents the idealized operation of the DeMi payload and does not account for near-field diffraction effects or optical misalignments. POPI therefore simulates the best possible signal on the image plane and Shack-Hartman wavefront sensors for a given deformable mirror shape. Here are some results of the POPI simulation. In this case, the 3.5 actuator was poked to 0.27 micron on the deformable mirror. Here's an image plane point spread function shown here, and the spots on the Shack-Hartman wavefront sensor, zoomed in so you can see the spots more clearly. It's kind of hard to tell the effect of the poke by eye, so here's a picture showing the difference of a poked measurement and a flat measurement here, and this shows the centered displacements of the Shack-Hartman spots compared to their nominal position. I used Gaussian fits to the PSF spot and the Shack-Hartman spots in order to measure their parameters to compare to flight measurements. Those results are shown here. I used the Shack-Hartman wavefront sensor simulated data to practice the wavefront reconstruction algorithm for DeMi. Our wavefront reconstruction procedure starts by measuring the centroid of each spot and calculating the displacement from nominal. Then the Moore-Penrose pseudo-inverse approach for zonal reconstruction is used to reconstruct the wavefront. From there, I fit a Gaussian function to this poke measurement in order to retrieve the actual actuator displacement. Here is a picture of the wavefront reconstruction applied to the simulation results shown in the slide before. Here's the Gaussian fit, and here's the residual. This low-level residual shows us that this Gaussian fit is a good way to retrieve the actuator displacement measurements. In this case, the measured actuator deflection was 241 nanometers, which is 90% of the input 270 nanometer deflection. This ratio, which is due to the tilt of the deformable mirror in the DeMi payload, is really important for us to understand as we are calibrating our payload actuator measurements. Next, I'm going to talk about the flight payload alignment and testing procedures. Here are some pictures from the flight alignment of the DeMi payload. We used a Zygo interferometer in order to align the DeMi payload, and then we installed each of the 7 individually controlled optical elements. The first step was to align the primary mirror to the Zygo interferometer, and then I added in each additional optical element after that and adjusted them in series in order to achieve the final alignment requirement of less than a quarter wave of wavefront error root mean square, which corresponds to less than 158 nanometers of mean wavefront error across the system. This picture shows the last interferometer measurement I took as I was aligning the flight payload, meeting our requirements of less than a quarter wave root mean square error. This picture shows the aligned DeMi optical bench with everything fully installed and all of the screws staked down and the thermal epoxy installed. Here are some measurements from the flight DeMi payload that can be compared to the simulations from POPI. Here's a picture of the Shack-Hartman wavefront sensor spot field, and here's a picture of the image plane wavefront sensor spot. I used the same Gaussian fit technique in order to measure these spot sizes, and I found that the flight payload measurements were slightly larger compared to the POPI model. This shows us that the flight measurements have some misalignments in them, so the POPI model isn't a perfect reproduction of the flight payload. However, the POPI model is still a very useful baseline to compare these measurements to and provides valuable simulated data for us to practice our image processing algorithms on. Here's an example of applying the Shack-Hartman wavefront sensor wavefront reconstruction code to data from the flight payload. Here is a wavefront reconstruction, a Gaussian fit, and a residual measurement for the actuator number 100 corresponding to the 3.5 position poked to 60 volts. In this case, we measured a deflection of 0.22 micron. In this case, the testing data makes it seem like these pokes are larger compared to the POPI simulated measurements. However, this is due to the fact that the Gaussian beam of the internal calibration laser illuminates fewer lenslet spots compared to the on-axis beam, which was simulated in POPI. So these are actually the same size of deflections due to single actuator pokes. This testing data and the POPI model results are currently being used to calibrate the flight payload data pipeline. Here are some pictures from the flight integration and testing of the DeMi payload. This was a very complicated process because there were a lot of electrical connections and optical fiber that needed to be carefully routed as we installed everything into the flight payload, into the flight bus. This picture shows some of my teammates lifting up the payload so that we can route the optical fiber and install everything in the proper order to get it to fit inside the flight bus properly. This picture shows the optical bench, the electronics module, the baffle, and the camera board mount all installed into the flight bus. The 6U bus was provided by Blue Canyon Technologies, and this spot right here is where all of the avionics go from BCT. After we installed everything into the flight bus and checked that the deformable mirror, the electronics, the cameras were all working properly, we brought the satellite to MIT Lincoln Laboratory for environmental testing. This picture shows the DeMi spacecraft installed in a thermal chamber for thermal cycle testing. After that, we did thermal vacuum testing, and we are using these data sets to analyze the temperature dependence of the DeMi payload. The last test we did was a vibration test. This shows the spacecraft installed on a vibration table at Lincoln Lab. This test showed us that the DeMi spacecraft was able to withstand the effects of the launch environment and still operated after this test. After passing environmental testing, DeMi was launched successfully to the International Space Station on February 15th of 2020. Deployment from the space station is expected in early July of 2020. I would like to express my sincere thanks to the entire DeMi team. This was really a team effort, and a successful launch would not have been possible without each and every one of you. In conclusion, CubeSat payloads are a very cool way to test out new technologies in space. For example, DeMi is going to gather very important data on MEMS deformable mirrors in space, which will be useful for future exoplanet imaging space telescope missions. Also, the POPI Shack-Hartman wavefront sensor code that was developed for this work has been incorporated into the develop branch of the POPI source code and is available at this link. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the presentation, Rachel. We've compiled a set of questions from the judges. The first question is, does the MEMS deformable mirror have any unique handling or environmental requirements beyond the normal precision optics and detectors that we're used to flying? You commented a little bit on it in the integration and test, but did you do pre and post alignments, and can you comment on that?
So pre and post vibration, well, before and after every test and during all of environmental testing, we took measurements where we first took a picture of the spot field on the Shack-Hartman in the image plane wavefront sensor. That way we could tell whether anything had shifted during these tests. We also did a thing called a poke test, where we poke every single actuator and we measure the deflection, and we keep track of the deflection measured over time for each actuator.
And that's I guess the question was, especially with the actuator throw or position accuracy, you know, was there repeatability there, or did you see bias or any kind of shift during those?
Yes, so MEMS deformable mirrors are known for their high repeatability because they're electrostatically actuated, and that gives them a lot of repeatability. We actually did notice some thermal dependence, which we think is due to the materials of the mirror itself. So there's some preliminary results shown here. So this shows the average poke deflection measured for a given voltage as a function of the temperature during thermal and thermal vacuum cycling testing. So you can see that there is an upward trend where when the temperature is higher, we do measure slightly higher poke deflections. So that's something we are still working on calibrating because we gathered a lot of really good data during environmental testing. So we're using this to calibrate it. And our on-orbit measurements in the on-orbit thermal environment will provide more information on this.
Okay, very good. That actually leads into the next question, and maybe you can expound on it a little bit more. You touched on it, but could you discuss any thoughts or future plans or lessons learned from the in-flight calibration procedures that you're planning?
Yeah, I think that in-flight calibration definitely requires a lot of thought ahead of time. So I think simulations like the Poppy simulation is really useful to make sure that you have a robust pipeline without any of those effects. So you need to first make sure that your data analysis works for absolutely perfect simulated data, and then you can analyze the effects of imperfect conditions. So I think having very careful testing procedures so that you know that you're running the exact same code for every case during environmental testing is really pivotal in terms of calibrating those effects.
Okay.
We also did a lot of measurements of the mirror itself in front of a zygo interferometer. So we just installed the mirror before we put it into the payload in front of the zygo interferometer and measured it. And I think that was really pivotal because there is some variation between actuators, and there is variation between deformable mirror drivers. So we used our driver, which was developed at MIT and is a miniaturized printed circuit board version of the driver that came with the mirror from the manufacturer. And we do see differing effects where each actuator actually behaves differently because the driver has different electrical components that can affect its response to an input voltage. So it is very complicated, and I think the lessons learned is definitely just more testing. So when you have the device and you have a way to test it, just do as much testing and get as much data as you can. It's definitely the lesson learned.
Okay. At the time of the paper submission, the Shack-Hartman wavefront sensor calibration was still ongoing. And I think you've extended some of that, but can you talk about any aha moments or any new information that you've discovered since the paper submission?
Sure. The work is still ongoing. In my case, it has been really interesting to revisit the zygo measurements or the mirror actuator measurements that we took before we installed the mirror into the payload. That's been really interesting to look into. I've been working on characterizing the background noise in those measurements in order to really understand exactly how well we know the voltage response of each actuator so that we can calibrate our Shack-Hartman sensor and understand exactly how well that Shack-Hartman sensor is measuring each actuator. This temperature dependence of the MEMS deformable mirror was something that we didn't really see coming, honestly. We reached out to the mirror manufacturer about this. We first tried to see if any other optical components in our system could have caused this temperature dependence. So I did some analysis of the Shack-Hartman sensor and whether the expansion of the mount for the lenslet array could account for this sort of variation, but that expansion was not anywhere near big enough to cause this sort of change in deflection measurement. So we did decide that it was due to the mirror itself. And we reached out to the mirror manufacturer, and they are not surprised by this temperature dependence, but said that no one has actually used it in elevated temperatures before because the typical application of this mirror is for microscope applications in biology where they have a very controlled environment. So that was really interesting, just seeing that there is a temperature dependence and working on trying to calibrate that so we can use this data has been very interesting.
Okay. Rachel, thank you very much for your presentation. And this concludes the paper oral presentations for this session.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.